ever stopped to think about how much of your life, the really basic stuff, what you eat, how you pay bills, even the energy powering your phone right now is shaped by these incredibly dense documents? Documents most people, frankly, will never read.
Exactly. We're talking about these huge legislative bills working their way through Congress. They're definitely not beach reading, but buried inside is the blueprint for potentially massive changes.
Changes that hit home, right? For individuals, for families, for whole industries, it's all in there.
It really is.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we try to cut through all that complexity. Our whole mission is to pull out the really crucial bits, the stuff you need to know, and give you a shortcut to understanding it all without getting lost in the weeds.
You got it. We do the slogging through the dense text so you don't have to.
And today we are diving deep into one monster of a document. It's a recent proposed bill, and it touches on, well, almost everything. It's got proposed changes across so many different government areas.
Yeah, it's a real beast. You get a glimpse of policy actually being hammered out. And some of the things tucked away in here are genuinely surprising, potentially really impactful.
So our goal today, distill it. Find the most important nuggets, the things that really matter for you listening right now. We're looking at what's actually being proposed and, crucially, why it matters in the real world.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this thing. The first big area we're digging into covers some really fundamental parts of daily life. We're talking about how families get food, how they handle their money, even things like education access.
Yeah, and what's really striking here is how these sometimes seemingly small policy tweaks can just ripple outwards. They can affect millions of people. Changes everything from, how you get food assistance to the way you file your taxes or figure out how to pay for college.
These aren't just minor adjustments then.
Not at all. They could really shift the ground under people's feet, financially speaking.
Okay, let's start with SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Food stamps, as many people know it. It's a critical program for millions. What's changing here?
Right. So one of the biggest things in this bill is a fundamental look at the thrifty food plan. This plan, it's basically been the measuring stick for decades for how much food aid families get. It defines what a, quote, nutritionally adequate diet costs.
And this bill wants to rewrite that definition.
Pretty much. It proposes striking the current legal definition in the Food and Nutrition Act and putting in a new one. And, this isn't just paperwork. It directly impacts the actual dollar amount people receive.
And I saw it gets really specific about the family they use for this calculation, something like a family of 4 specific ages.
Yeah, it does. It spells it out. A man and woman, aged 20 to 50, a kid aged 6 to 8, and another kid 9 to 11. That specific family unit becomes the benchmark for calculating costs for everyone, which is an interesting methodological choice.
A very specific snapshot. And it also counts for regional differences, right? Because food doesn't cost the same everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. The bill requires the Secretary of Agriculture to create separate plans for places like Hawaii, urban and rural Alaska, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. It acknowledges that reality. But there's a catch for Guam and the Virgin Islands. Their cost adjustments can't actually exceed the cost calculated for the 50 states and D.C.
Ah, so there's a cap. Tailoring, but with a ceiling.
Right. It's trying to balance regional needs with overall program costs. And this isn't a one-and-done calculation either. Starting October 1st, 2025, the cost of this plan gets adjusted every year.
Based on inflation.
Yep, based on the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, the CPIU. So the idea is to keep the benefit amount from losing its purchasing power over time as prices go up. Yeah. For families relying on SNAP, that annual adjustment is, well, it's vital.
Makes sense. It keeps the assistance relevant. So the big picture here is that this changes the baseline, the very definition of what it costs to eat adequately, and that directly sets the benefit levels.
Precisely. It's a foundational piece of the program.
Okay, next up under SNAP, work requirements. This is always a hot topic, isn't it? Who needs to work to get benefits?
Always. This bill proposes modifying the rules for what they call able-bodied adults without dependents, or ABAWDs.
Yeah.
The existing exemptions mostly stay in place. People under 18 or over 65 are exempt.
Okay.
Also exempt are those who are medically certified as unfit for work or parents responsible for a dependent child. That's pretty standard stuff.
Right, protecting vulnerable groups. But I saw something about non-contiguous states like Alaska and Hawaii.
Yeah, that's a new wrinkle.
Yeah.
The Secretary of Agriculture gets the power to exempt individuals in those states, but not Guam or the Virgin Islands. Interestingly, if the state agency can show they've made a good faith effort to comply with the work rules, the state has to provide specific info to justify it.
So a bit of flexibility for states with unique challenges, different job markets maybe.
That seems to be the idea. It acknowledges that finding work might be tougher in some places, but it still means states have to try. It sort of redefines the line for who has to meet those work or training requirements to keep their benefits.
Which, again, directly impacts people who might be struggling to find work that meets the criteria, could push people into training, but also risks cutting off benefits.
It's a delicate balance they're trying to strike, or at least proposing to strike.
Okay, moving on. Restrictions on internet expenses in SNP calculations. This seems like a small detail, but in today's world.
It's definitely not small in impact. The bill makes it explicit. Any fee for internet connection cannot be used when calculating the excess shelter expense deduction.
Okay, explain that deduction again.
Sure. It's a way SNP helps families with really high housing costs. Certain expenses, like rent or utilities, can reduce their countable income, meaning they might get a little more SNA aid.
But internet costs are now explicitly out of that calculation.
Correct. And that's significant because, let's face it, internet isn't really a luxury anymore. You need it for job hunting, school, telehealth, just managing life. Previously, it could sometimes be factored in. Now it's off the table for this specific deduction.
So even if it's a necessary bill for a family, it won't help lower their countable income for SNME in this way.
Exactly. It could mean slightly lower benefits for some families, especially those already stretching every dollar. It implicitly says internet is necessary, maybe, but not shelter costs like rent.
Got it. And the last SNP item here is about alien eligibility, another area that always seems to be under scrutiny.
Yes, this amends the rules again. It clarifies and maybe narrows who among non-citizens can get SNP. Basically, you have to be a resident of the U.S. and either a U.S. citizen or national. Or an alien lawfully admitted for permanent residence, a green card holder, essentially.
Yep.
It uses the specific definitions from immigration law.
And it also specifically excludes certain groups, doesn't it?
It does. It clearly states that alien visitors, tourists, diplomats, and temporary students who plan to return to their home country are not eligible. So it tightens the definition.
What's the likely impact there?
It could limit access for certain immigrant communities. It might mean more paperwork and scrutiny for state agencies verifying status, and potentially fewer non-citizen families qualifying for food assistance.
Okay, shifting from direct aid like SNAP, this bill gets really ambitious with taxes. You mentioned permanent relief for the middle class. That sounds like a big promise.
It's definitely a headline grabber. And this section proposes some really sweeping changes, potentially making parts of the current tax code permanent.
Yeah.
It really raises the question, how would these changes, lower rates, bigger deductions, new credits, actually reshape finances for everyday people?
Let's start with the tax rates themselves. The bill wants to extend the reduced rates that have been in place for the last few years.
That's the plan. It essentially makes the rates from the 2018-2025 period permanent. It does this by amending the Internal Revenue Code, literally striking out the end date, so that tax structure becomes the new normal.
And it adjusts for inflation too, right? So you don't get pushed into higher brackets just because prices go up.
Yes, that's crucial. It specifies how inflation adjustments will work for tax years after 2025, specifically for the brackets above 12% and 22%. The goal is to prevent that bracket creep, ensuring the benefit of the lower rates keeps pace with the cost of living, at least in theory.
So cementing that structure. And similarly, it wants to make the increased standard deduction permanent too. That affects almost everyone who files taxes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Same logic here. It amends the code, removes the 2025 sunset date. For most taxpayers, this means continuing to benefit from a larger standard deduction, which simplifies filing and reduces taxable income without needing to itemize things like mortgage interest or state taxes.
But there's something new in there too, a deduction specifically for seniors.
Yeah, this is interesting. It adds a new $6,000 deduction for qualified individuals. That means people 65 or older or who are blind. But there's a time limit. It's only for tax years before January 1, 2029. And you need to report your Social Security number, and married couples have to file jointly to get it.
So a targeted temporary boost for seniors.
Exactly. A specific bit of relief for that group for a few years.
Okay, and then the child tax credit. That's been huge news, especially since the pandemic changes. What's happening there?
The bill aims to enhance it. It increases the maximum refundable amount. That refundable part is key. It means even if you owe no taxes, you can get the credit back as cash. Direct support.
More money back for families.
Potentially, yes. And like the Thrifty Food Plan and the tax brackets, it builds in an inflation adjustment. Hmm. Starting after 2024, that $1,400 refundable amount gets adjusted for cost of living increases each year.
So trying to maintain its value over time.
Right. The goal seems to be providing more stable, predictable support for families with kids, especially those with lower incomes who benefit most from the refundable part.
All right, now for some completely new ideas in the tax code. First up, no tax on tips. That sounds revolutionary almost.
It's definitely a novel concept for the U.S. tax code. It introduces a brand new deduction specifically for qualified tips earned in a trade or business.
A deduction, not an exemption. So it reduces your taxable income.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's a deduction capped at $25,000 for single filers. But there's an income limit, too. The deduction gets reduced if your modified adjusted gross income, your MAGI, is over $150,000 single, or $300,000 if you're filing jointly.
So it's aimed more at moderate income tipped workers, not high earners.
Seems that way. And to make it work, there are new reporting requirements. Employers would need to separately account for cash tips and note the worker's occupation. It's a very targeted policy for industries like restaurants, hospitality, delivery places where tips are a huge part of income. A direct financial boost.
Interesting. And following that same pattern, there's no tax on overtime compensation.
Yep, another new deduction. This one is for qualified overtime compensation. Similar structure. It's capped at $12,500 for single filers, $25,000 for joint filers.
And the same income phase out.
Exactly the same. Starts phasing out above $150,000 MAGI single, $300,000 joint. This one applies to tax years starting after December 31st, 2024.
So again, relief for workers putting in extra hours, but primarily middle-income earners.
That's the clear target. It's aimed at boosting disposable income for people working significant overtime. You could almost see it as an incentive, or at least a recognition for that extra work, putting more cash back in their pockets.
Okay, this next one really jumps out. No tax on car loan interest. That affects a massive number of households.
This could be very popular, yeah. This amends the code to let you deduct interest paid on a qualified passenger vehicle loan. Usually interest on personal loans like car loans isn't deductible. This carves out an exception.
For how long? Is this permanent?
No, this one is temporary. It applies only to tax years 2025 through 2028. And it's specifically for interest on loans taken out after December 31st, 2024 to buy a personal use car. And the loan has to be the primary lien on the vehicle.
Any catches? Does it apply to, say, leased cars or business vehicles?
Nope. Excludes fleet sales, commercial vehicles, and leases. Strictly for personal car purchases. And, like the tip and overtime deductions, there's an income limit. The deduction starts phasing out if your MDI is over $100,000 single or $200,000 joint.
So, again, focused on middle-income buyers.
Right, and lenders would have new reporting duties they'd have to tell both you and the IRS how much qualified interest you paid. It's a direct, though temporary, tax break. Could definitely goose car sales for a few years, give people some relief on those payments.
But maybe creates a cliff effect when it expires.
That's always the risk with temporary incentives, yeah. Could pull demand forward.
Okay, one more tax item. Charitable contributions. This one helps people who don't itemize, right?
Yes, and that's most taxpayers these days. This makes the temporary partial deduction for non-itemizers permanent and expands it quite a bit. Instead of the current $300 single, $600 joint limit,
It goes up.
way up to $1,000 for single filers, $2,000 for joint filers. And it removes the expiration date, making it permanent starting after December 31st, 2025.
So a much bigger incentive for more people to give to charity.
That's the clear goal. Offer a real tax benefit for giving, even if you take the standard deduction. Could be a significant boost for nonprofits.
Okay, let's pull back for a second. We've seen changes to food aid, big shifts in tax policy aimed at middle-class relief. It feels like a broad effort to ease financial pressures. But then the bill pivots to another huge financial stressor, student debt.
Absolutely. And the proposals here are, well, they represent a really significant rethinking of how we finance higher education, especially for graduate students, and how people repay their loans. It connects directly to those workforce goals we see elsewhere.
Let's start with the loan limits for graduate and professional students. This sounds like a major shakeup. Grad students could often borrow quite a bit.
It's a fundamental change. Starting July 4th, 2026, graduate and professional students would no longer be eligible for federal direct Stafford loans, period.
Wow. So what happens before then?
Between now and then, the current annual limit on unsubsidized Stafford loans stays at $20,500. But after that date, new annual limits kick in, generally $20,500, but higher, up to $40,500 for certain high-cost programs like medicine or dentistry.
And it also cuts off PLUS loans for grad students. Many rely on those to cover the full cost.
Yes, that's another huge change. Starting July 1, 2026, no more federal direct PLUS loans for graduate or professional students either. That avenue's just closed off.
So where does that leave them? Private loans?
That seems a likely outcome, or needing much larger personal savings. And there's one more piece, a new aggregate loan limit. Starting July 1, 2026, there's a maximum lifetime borrowing cap of $257,500 for all federal loans combined, except parent PLUS loans.
Yeah.
And that's a hard cut. It doesn't matter if you've repaid some, had some forgiven, whatever.
That is a massive restructuring. It could really change who can afford graduate school, especially in expensive fields or cities.
It absolutely could. It might really shift reliance onto the private loan market or just make certain degrees unattainable for students without significant personal or family resources.
Okay, but alongside those restrictions, the bill also pushes for income-based repayment plans for everyone.
Yes, this is the flip side. It mandates that by July 1, 2028, the Secretary of Education has to get every borrower with outstanding federal loans onto an income-based repayment plan.
Every single borrower.
That's the mandate. Borrowers would have to choose a new income-based plan. If they don't pick one for loans taken out after July 1, 2026, they default into a standard repayment plan, which might not be affordable. And all of a borrower's loans have to be consolidated under the same repayment plan.
So simplification is the goal, tying payments to income.
That seems to be the main driver. Make payments more manageable by linking them to what people actually earn rather than a fixed amount based on the debt size. Could be a big help for many.
And then there's this completely new repayment assistance plan for distressed borrowers. This sounds targeted at those really struggling.
It's designed as a significant safety net. It has a couple of really key features. First, an interest subsidy. If you make your payments on time, the government helps cover some of the accruing interest, preventing that awful situation where your balance keeps growing even when you're paying.
That alone is huge, but there's more.
Yes, the really big piece is balance assistance. This means actual principal reduction. It happens if your required monthly payment is enough to cover the interest, or if you make 120 on-time payments.
So a path to actually shrinking the debt, not just treading water.
Exactly. It's a potential game changer. It moves beyond just interest management to offering a real way to reduce the principal over time. Eligibility is based on income, AGI, and family size, targeting lower-income borrowers. And states can use data from programs like SNAP or TANF to help verify income, which could simplify enrollment.
This could genuinely help people escape that feeling of being trapped under growing debt.
That's clearly the hope. Provide real relief and a path towards becoming debt-free for those struggling the most.
Okay, last piece in this education section. Workforce Pell Grants. This feels like a very direct effort to link education funding to job market needs.
It's a strong signal in that direction. This creates a new program within the Pell Grant system specifically for students in programs leading to a recognized post-secondary credential, think certificates, licenses, not necessarily traditional degrees.
And the programs have to meet certain criteria.
Yes, they need state recognition, they have to meet hiring needs of employers in high-demand fields, and they should lead to credentials that stack up or transfer, or directly prepare students for gainful employment. It's very job-focused.
I saw it even defines a working adult for measuring success.
It does. For tracking outcomes, a working adult is defined, for instance, as someone aged 25-34, not currently in college, with maybe just a high school diploma if the program is for an associate's or bachelor's. And these programs will be monitored annually. They'll look at the median earnings of graduates compared to other working adults in that field.
If they don't measure up.
If a program fails to meet those earnings benchmarks for 2 years straight, it can lose its eligibility for these workforce Pell Grants. So there's real accountability tied to employment outcomes.
It's a significant push towards vocational and skills-based training, trying to create a clearer path from classroom to career.
Definitely. A major investment trying to bridge the skills gap and align education with economic needs.
All right, let's shift gears now into healthcare. This bill proposes some pretty significant changes to Medicaid, how it runs, who qualifies, and how care is paid for.
Yeah, and changes here are always critical. They can have immediate, real-world consequences for millions of vulnerable people who rely on Medicaid for their healthcare access.
First up, Medicaid eligibility redeterminations. It sounds like the bill wants states to check eligibility much more often.
That's exactly right. It requires states to recheck eligibility for people covered under the ACA Medicaid expansion, mostly low-income adults, every 6 months.
6 months. That's way more frequent than it usually is, isn't it?
Much more frequent. Often it's annual, sometimes even less frequent during emergencies. This is a big shift towards tighter, more frequent verification. And starting in late 2029, states have to use specific data matching systems like Paris to verify addresses.
What's the likely effect of checking so often? Better program integrity.
That's the stated goal. Reduce improper payments, make sure only eligible people are enrolled. But the flip side is a huge increase in administrative work for states, and more importantly, a potential barrier for beneficiaries.
How so?
Well, imagine someone who moves frequently or doesn't have reliable internet or mail access. Having to navigate that redetermination paperwork twice a year could easily lead to them losing coverage, even if they're still technically eligible. It's the churn problem, people falling off and having to re-enroll.
A potential administrative hurdle tripping people up. Okay, next, revising the home equity limit for long-term care. This affects how people, especially seniors, qualify for Medicaid to pay for nursing homes or home care, right?
It does. Medicaid has rules about how much your home can be worth if you need long-term care paid for. This bill gives states more options here. The current limit, which adjusts for inflation around $750K in 2023, still applies generally.
But states get more flexibility.
Yes, particularly for homes not on farmland. For those non-agricultural homes, states can choose to apply a higher limit up to $1 million. And they can do this without having to apply it uniformly across the state. This starts January 1, 2028.
So potentially allowing some people to keep a more valuable home and still qualify for Medicaid long-term care.
Potentially, yes. It offers more flexibility for states and could help some individuals while still keeping a limit based on home equity as part of the eligibility calculation.
And mirroring what we saw with SNAP, there's also a section on alien Medicaid eligibility, tightening the rules here too.
Yes, very similar pattern. Starting October 1st, 2026, the federal government generally won't provide matching funds for medical assistance unless the individual is a resident of a state, D.C., or territory, and meets specific citizenship or immigration status requirements.
Which are?
U.S. citizen or national, a lawful permanent resident, green card holder, a Cuban or Haitian entrant, or someone lawfully residing under a compact of free association, those agreements with certain Pacific Island nations.
So it narrows the field, similar to the SNAP changes.
It does. It makes the criteria stricter for non-citizens, potentially limiting access to Medicaid for certain groups who might have qualified under previous rules or specific state policies, could lead to more uninsured people in those communities.
Okay, let's look at measures aimed at cost control and patient responsibility. The first one is a moratorium on staffing standards for long-term care facilities. What's that about?
This basically puts a temporary halt on implementing any new federal staffing standards for nursing homes and other long-term care facilities under Medicare and Medicaid.
So stopping potential rules that might require, say, more nurses per resident.
Exactly. Those kinds of standards are meant to improve care quality. This moratorium delays them. It's likely a response to industry concerns about the cost and difficulty of meeting stricter staffing requirements, especially with ongoing workforce shortages.
So it eases pressure on the facilities.
But potentially delays improvements in care quality that patient advocates argue are needed. It's a trade-off between industry viability and patient care standards.
Next, reducing state Medicaid costs by focusing on erroneous payments. How does this work?
It tweaks the rules around the federal government's share of Medicaid costs, the FMAP. Specifically, it changes how states are penalized for making incorrect payments. If a state's error rate goes above a certain threshold, like 3%, this bill increases the amount the feds can claw back.
A bigger stick to encourage accuracy?
Essentially, yes. And it broadens the definition of an erroneous payment to include cases where there just isn't enough information to confirm eligibility. So states really need to tighten up their verification.
More pressure on states to get it right, which could impact their budgets if they don't.
Definitely. Could push states towards investing more in administrative systems or potentially being overly cautious in approving applications.
Now, this next one sounds like a really big deal. Community engagement requirements, tying Medicaid eligibility to work or similar activities.
This is a major policy shift, yeah. It requires states to implement community engagement rules for many adults covered under the ACA Medicaid expansion. These individuals would need to document that they're working, doing community service, searching for jobs, in school, or caregiving for at least 80 hours a month.
80 hours a month. Who is exempt from this?
There are mandatory exceptions. People under 18 or over 65, those deemed medically frail, pregnant women, people getting unemployment benefits, certain students, parents of young kids. States can also grant temporary hardship exemptions.
And if someone doesn't meet the requirement?
States have to verify compliance when they redetermine eligibility. If someone isn't compliant, they get a notice and a 30-day window to comply. If they still don't, they can be disenrolled from Medicaid. States also have to do outreach to explain the rules.
Wow. So your health coverage could depend on documenting these activities? That seems like it could impact a lot of people.
Huge impact potential. It mirrors past welfare-to-work reforms. Yeah. Critics worry it will lead to people losing coverage, not because they aren't eligible based on income or health need, but because they struggle with the documentation or finding qualifying activities, especially people with unstable jobs, transportation issues, or undiagnosed health problems. It's arguably the most controversial Medicaid change in the bill.
Definitely one to watch. And then there's also modifying cost sharing for certain expansion individuals. What's changing with premiums and copays?
It's a bit complex. Starting October 1, 2028, states cannot charge premiums or enrollment fees to Medicaid expansion adults whose income is above the poverty line, so no premiums for that group.
Okay, that sounds like a benefit, but
Next, states must impose some form of cost sharing like copays or deductibles, greater than zero for certain services for these same individuals. The state gets to decide which services and how much, within limits.
are essential services protected from these copays?
Yes, that's key. Primary care, mental health, substance use disorder services, and services from community health centers or rural clinics are exempt from this mandatory cost sharing. And there's an overall annual cap on out-of-pocket costs at 5% of household income.
So eliminate premiums, but mandate some copays for non-essential services with protections. A mixed bag.
The very mixed bag. It shifts the financial responsibility, eliminates premiums, which can be a barrier, but introduces other potential out-of-pocket costs, albeit with important guardrails.
Finally, in healthcare, adjustments to coverage of home or community-based services, HCBS. This is about encouraging care outside of institutions.
Exactly. HCBS waivers allow states to use Medicaid funds for services that help people stay in their homes or communities instead of going into nursing homes. This bill, starting July 1st, 2028, gives the Secretary of HHS more flexibility to approve these waivers, even if they bend some existing rules.
What's the catch? States have to prove something.
They have to prove cost neutrality. The state must demonstrate that the average cost per person for HCBS under the waiver won't be more than the average cost would have been for institutional care for those same people.
So promoting home care, but making sure it doesn't break the bank.
Right. It encourages the shift towards care settings people generally prefer and which can sometimes be more cost-effective. But it requires careful planning and data from the states to ensure it doesn't increase overall Medicaid spending.
Okay, let's pivot. We're moving into areas that grab big headlines. National security, borders, energy. This bill pumps serious money and policy changes into these zones.
Yeah, these sections really lay out broad strategic priorities. We're talking billions upon billions in spending that will shape our military posture, how we manage immigration, and our energy landscape for potentially decades.
Let's start with defense. Huge funding increases for the Department of Defense resources. What are the main buckets here?
They break it down into a few key areas. First, there's a big focus on quality of life for military personnel. Over $7.8 billion is allocated here.
What does that cover specifically?
Things like $2.5 billion to fix up and modernize barracks for unaccompanied service members, $2 billion for the Defense Health Program, almost $3 billion to boost the basic allowance for housing to help families with rent, $50 million for bonuses, $590 million to extend the temporary lodging allowance during moves, even money for schools serving military kids, and for helping military spouses get professional licenses when they relocate.
So really trying to address those practical pain points of military life.
Seems like it. The goal is clearly to improve recruitment, keep people in uniform, and generally make life better for service members and their families. It recognizes that people are the foundation.
Then there's a massive chunk for shipbuilding.
Huge. $15 billion earmarked for ships. Specifically, $13 billion to buy 2 Virginia-class submarines and 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, core components of the fleet, and $2 billion for the newer FFG-62 class frigates.
A direct injection into naval power and the defense industry.
Absolutely. Strengthening the fleet, keeping shipyards busy, a clear signal about maritime presence.
And the third big defense piece, integrated air and missile defense. Nearly $10 billion there.
Yeah, this covers a lot of high-tech ground. Billions for buying more air-to-air missiles. Money to expand U.S. production capacity for various missiles, medium-range air-to-air, anti-radiation missiles, even long-range sea mines. Funds to speed up development of drones and loitering munitions. Plus, investments in the underlying industrial base, like factories making solid rocket motors.
So not just buying weapons, but boosting our ability to make them domestically.
Exactly. That's a major theme. It also includes funding for things like advanced radar depots, programs to make U.S. systems easier to export to allies, developing long-range interceptors for missile defense, and pushing forward with hypersonic weapons programs.
It's a comprehensive modernization and expansion effort. Advanced weapons, domestic production.
That's the picture, focusing on cutting-edge capabilities and ensuring the U.S. can build and sustain them.
Okay, so massive defense investments. Now, turning domestically, the bill pours equally significant resources into border security and immigration enforcement. This is clearly a major priority area.
It definitely is. And this really raises the question of how these different pieces, infrastructure, personnel, technology, state funding, fit together to reshape the approach to border management and immigration.
Let's start with the most visible part. Border infrastructure and the wall system. Huge funding there.
$46.5 billion, roughly. For fiscal year 2025, available for several years, it's designated for building and improving barriers, primary, secondary, even waterborne ones, plus access roads and all the tech that goes with it. Cameras, lights, sensors, detection systems. Also covers prepping the ground for construction.
A massive commitment to physical barriers and surveillance stack.
Unmistakably. It aligns with strategies heavily focused on physical deterrence and monitoring along the border.
Alongside the physical wall, there's funding for CBP personnel, vehicles, and facilities, beefing up the human element.
Big time. $8.5 billion for customs and border protection. $3.5 billion of that is specifically to hire more Border Patrol agents, aiming for at least 22,000 agents by FY 2026. That's a significant increase.
More boots on the ground. What else?
$1.3 billion for things like planes and boats for patrol. And $3.7 billion to build or renovate facilities, including 7 new Border Patrol stations, 2 temporary processing centers, and 5 forward operating bases closer to the border.
So more agents, better equipment, more infrastructure to support them, a major expansion of CBP's operational footprint.
Definitely, aiming for a much more robust presence and capacity all along the border.
The bill also invests in border security technology and screening. This is about using smarter tools.
Right. Over $6 billion allocated here, again available for several years. This is for buying things like advanced non-intrusive inspection systems. Think fancy scanners using AI and machine learning to spot drugs like fentanyl at ports of entry and along the border. Also money to upgrade aircraft and boats used by air and marine operations.
So complementing the physical barriers and personnel with high-tech detection.
That's the idea.
Wow.
Enhance the ability to find and stop contraband and unauthorized crossings using sophisticated technology.
Now, there's the State Border Security Reinforcement Fund. This sounds like pulling states more directly into federal enforcement efforts.
It does seem that way. It creates a new $2.5 billion fund within DHS, specifically for grants to state and local governments.
What can they use the money for?
Several things. Getting reimbursed for border-related costs they've incurred since January 2021, costs for detaining or removing non-citizens who've committed crimes, and even funding to relocate unlawfully present individuals from smaller towns to other places within the U.S., presumably to ease local burdens.
Are there conditions for states to get this money?
Yes, a big one.
Yeah.
States have to be fully compliant with a federal law that prohibits them from restricting information sharing with federal immigration authorities. So no sanctuary city-type policies if you want this funding.
So it provides money, but enforces cooperation with federal immigration goals, decentralizing some efforts, but with strings attached.
Exactly. Could lead to more integrated enforcement, but raises questions about state versus federal roles.
Looking at specific procedures, there's funding for protecting alien children from exploitation through biometric collection.
Yes, it provides funds to collect fingerprints and DNA from undocumented individuals, including children, entering without visas. The stated goal is child protection, consistent with existing laws on biometrics. It means more systematic data collection for UACs and others.
And relatedly, criminal and gang checks for unaccompanied alien children UACs aged 12 and up.
Right. Funding for specific checks on older UACs, including looking for gang tattoos or markings. It implements stricter vetting for this group, reflecting concerns about gang activity, but could slow processing and raises privacy issues, especially around physical examinations.
Finally, under this umbrella, a massive enhancement of immigration enforcement via ICE, $25 billion.
A huge sum for immigration and customs enforcement. It covers a lot. Funding to maintain at least 32,500 detention beds daily. Money to hire more ICE officers and staff, sweetened with large potential bonuses up to $20K for field officers, $40K for support staff to attract talent. Funds for transporting people for deportation. IT upgrades for enforcement systems.
And it tackles the immigration court backlog. That's a huge bottleneck.
Directly. $1.2 billion is set aside to hire more immigration judges and support staff, aiming to get the total number of judges up to 800 by late 2028. There's also funding specifically for combating drug trafficking, especially fentanyl, and another $1 billion in grants for state and local police to help find and arrest undocumented immigrants who've committed crimes and to investigate drug and human trafficking.
So it's a full-spectrum boost for ICE. Detention, deportation, staffing, courts, drug interdictions, state partnerships.
Exactly. A significant scaling up of ICE's operational capacity across the board, aiming to speed up enforcement actions and case resolutions dramatically.
Okay, it's undeniable, massive focus on defense and border security. But what about energy policy? Does the bill make moves there, maybe impacting renewables or fossil fuels?
Oh, absolutely. There are some very targeted changes. Rescinding funds for one green program, mandating more oil and gas development, creating new fees for renewables, and adding significant restrictions to clean energy tax credits.
Let's start with the rescission. The Green and Resilient Retrofit Program for multifamily housing. Pulling the plug on that.
Essentially, yes. It rescinds any unspent money previously allocated to this program, which was designed to help make apartment buildings more energy efficient and climate resilient.
So, a shift in priorities away from that specific green investment.
It appears so. Ending that program suggests a reevaluation of where federal dollars should go for energy efficiency, moving away from this particular initiative.
Then, a major push for oil and gas lease sales. This sounds like doubling down on fossil fuels.
It's a very strong signal in that direction. Multiple sections mandate more frequent and larger oil and gas lease sales on federal lands and offshore. Onshore, it requires at least 4 sales per year in key western states and Alaska, offering up at least half the available acreage each time.
And offshore, often more controversial.
It mandates at least 30 large, region-wide lease sales in specific offshore areas according to a set schedule. Very aggressive. It also extends lease terms to 10 years initially and gives companies longer periods, up to 5 years, to pause operations if needed. Plus, it increases the minimum royalty rate the government collects.
And a specific directive for the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska.
Yes, it directs the Interior Department to offer all available areas in the NPRA for lease between now and 2030, with rules on how sales happen and money gets shared with Alaska. Taken together, it's a major acceleration and expansion of domestic oil and gas drilling.
A clear prioritization of fossil fuel production. Now, what about renewables? There's a new acreage rent for wind and solar projects on public land.
That's right. This imposes a new annual fee, an acreage rent, on companies holding rights of way for wind or solar projects on federal land. It's calculated per acre, starting at $5 per acre in 2026, adjusted for inflation annually.
A new cost for renewable developers. Where does that money go?
It gets collected by the Treasury. Starting in 2026, these revenues, plus bonus bids and other fees from renewables, get split. 25% to the state where the project is, 25% to the county, and 50% to the U.S. Treasury's general fund.
So it creates a new revenue stream from renewables on public land, shared between federal, state, and local governments. Could impact the economics of those projects?
It certainly adds a new operating cost they'll have to factor in.
Finally, in energy, these restrictions on clean electricity credits based on foreign entities. This sounds like a major Buy American push for the green economy.
It's exactly that, with a national security angle. It amends the big tax credits for clean electricity production, like wind and solar farms, and investment, like battery storage. It says you lose the credit if your project or key components received material assistance from a prohibited foreign entity.
Prohibited foreign entity, that sounds critical. How is it defined?
Broadly, it includes foreign entities that are foreign-controlled or foreign-influenced. This could mean significant ownership by a foreign entity, ties to foreign governments, contracts giving foreigners control over operations or IP, even certain payments. It's aimed squarely at reducing reliance on supply chains potentially linked to geopolitical rivals, especially China.
What do companies have to do to prove they're compliant?
They have to certify they've done their homework due diligence to ensure their components aren't coming from these prohibited entities. And there are penalties for getting it wrong, including losing the tax credits entirely. These rules generally kick in for projects starting construction after December 31st, 2025.
So, a huge incentive to source clean energy tech domestically or from friendly nations could really reshape the industry's supply chains.
A massive potential impact, yes.
Yeah.
Driving investment in U.S. manufacturing for clean energy components, but also potentially increasing costs or slowing deployment in the short term if domestic supply can't keep up.
Okay, last section. Let's touch on two unique provisions addressing specific historical issues and government accountability.
Right. These show how legislation can look back to address past harms, like with radiation exposure, or look forward to ensure oversight, like with pandemic spending.
This first one is really interesting. Amendments to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, expanding help for people sickened by Cold War nuclear testing.
Exactly. And it raises the question, how much broader does eligibility become? Who might qualify now who didn't before? This is about acknowledging harm that potentially affected many more people and places than originally recognized.
The bill expands the geographic areas covered and the time frame, right? Who are the downwinders now?
Significantly broader. It adds whole new counties in states like Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, even Oregon that weren't covered before, places where fallout likely drifted. And the eligible time period of exposure is stretched way out from basically 1944 through 1962, covering earlier Manhattan Project work and later tests.
That sounds like it could bring in a lot more people.
Potentially, yes. Many more individuals and communities could now fall under the expanded geographic and time definitions, making them eligible for compensation if they develop certain illnesses.
And the compensation amounts are changing, too, relating it more to medical costs.
For living claimants, yes. They can now receive the greater of $50,000 or their actual eligible medical expenses, provided they have the records. But costs already covered by insurance or Medicare Medicaid don't count. And they need to submit those medical expense claims by the end of 2028.
What about families of those who passed away?
The rules are clarified there, too. A surviving spouse can get $25,000. If no spouse, surviving children split that amount. It aims to provide more substantial help for living claimants based on real costs and a clearer, simpler process for surviving family members.
And it clarifies what counts as physical presence to make it easier to prove eligibility.
Yes. It specifies that living in the affected area, working there, or going to school there for at least 2 years after 1949 counts as physical presence, trying to remove ambiguity and make the claims process more straightforward for people who are definitely exposed.
Okay, shifting to financial oversight. Changes to the SEC Reserve Fund. What's happening there?
It restructures how the Securities and Exchange Commission manages this fund. It basically dissolves the old structure but explicitly keeps the money available without needing new appropriations to pay whistleblower awards. That's a key tool for the SEC.
So, prioritizing whistleblowers, what happens to other money in the fund?
Existing obligated funds can be spent until October 2025. After that, any leftover balance goes back to the main U.S. Treasury General Fund. It streamlines the SEC's funding structure, emphasizing the whistleblower program.
And finally, funding for the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, keeping oversight going for COVID spending.
Seems so. It appropriates $88 million for fiscal year 2026, available until spent, specifically for this committee to continue its work overseeing the massive federal spending related to the pandemic.
So a signal that accountability for that spending is still a priority, even years later.
Exactly. Keeping an independent body funded to track where the money went and how effectively it was used, ensuring transparency and learning lessons.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground. This proposed bill, it's just staggering in its scope, isn't it?
It really is.
We've gone from the details of S&P food benefits and massive tax code changes to reshaping student loans and graduate education, huge boosts in defense spending, a multi-pronged approach to border security and immigration, significant shifts in energy policy favoring fossil fuels while trying to onshore green tech, and even looking back to compensate victims of nuclear testing.
Yeah, when you lay it all out like that,
Well,
these seemingly separate pieces, they really weave together. They paint a picture of, well, shifting national priorities
Yeah.
and the complex ways policy tries to achieve them. It touches almost every aspect of life.
from the grocery aisle to your tax forms, national security to healthcare rules, energy sources to historical justice, it's all interconnected.
Absolutely.
So, as you, our listeners, digest all of this, What part of this massive proposal do you think will actually cause the biggest ripples? Where will we see the most tangible change on the ground in the next few years? And how might all these shifts from work rules for benefits to new energy projects to different loan limits fundamentally reshape the way we live, maybe in ways we aren't even thinking about yet?
It's a lot to consider.
Definitely food for thought. And hopefully this deep dive helps you navigate that complexity and understand the forces that are often quietly shaping your world.